Well, here's how we start off today. US President Barack Obama is a man of many firsts. He is, of course, the first black president in the United States and the first to visit China in his first year in office. This week, his four-day visit to Beijing and Shanghai made global headlines. The reason is simple, that no matter what the relationship between Beijing and Washington, it holds the future of the world in its hands.
Winter in Beijing. 10 a.m., the presidents of the United States and China meet at the Great Hall of the People. 37 winters ago, President Richard Nixon reached out to China. That handshake had crossed an ocean and 20 years of hostility. 30 winters ago, Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping shook hands with President Jimmy Carter at the White House, the first after diplomatic ties were established. And this time, the leaders once again seized the opportunity for a new start for China-US relations.
Both
President Obama and I spoke positively of the progress in the bilateral ties since the new U.S. administration took office. We both agreed to develop a strategic, long-term perspective in dialogue and exchange and work together to build a positive, cooperative and comprehensive China-US relationship.
Barack Obama spent 4 days in China, the most in his 7-day Asian trip. In a high-intensity schedule, he visited the Forbidden City, former home of emperors, and the centuries-old Great Wall. In the world of diplomacy, visiting a country's noted landmarks is considered a sign of respect. But that respect was questioned back in the US capital. President Obama has emerged from his first trip to China with no big breakthroughs on important issues. If there was any significant change during this trip, in fact, it was in the United States' new conciliatory and sometimes laudatory tone. Critics say Obama's policy towards China stands in stark contrast to his predecessors. When Bill Clinton took office in 1993, he threatened economic sanctions and brought up human rights with China. And when George W. Bush took office in 2001, he took a hardline approach, calling China a strategic rival.
When a
new U.S. president comes into power, U.S.-China relations would first undergo deterioration, and then there would be a recovery. But Obama's China policy opened with a high start. I think that change reflects that China's increasing national strength weighs more heavily on U.S. strategic needs.
When Obama arrived in China, he had an agenda in mind. Topic 1. Financial crisis. In September, the IMF predicted that the US economy could shrink by 2.7% and unemployment could rise to 10%. In contrast, China is likely to overtake Japan to become the world's second largest economy by 2010, according to a research paper published by the University of Nottingham. China now holds more than $800 billion in government bonds, more than any other nation. Before Obama left for China, the New York Times called him a profligate spender coming to pay respects to his banker. Topic 2. Anti-terrorism. In March, the Obama administration announced a new strategy for Afghanistan and Pakistan. It marked a major shift from Iraq to destroying the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in these two countries. China shares long borders with Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's long pursued a stable environment with them. The US needs China's help to crack down on terrorism. Topic 3. Climate change. China and the US are the world's two biggest emitters of greenhouse gases.
Daddy, you won the Nobel Peace Prize.
This year's Nobel Peace Prize winner has long been promoting global cooperation on climate change. In September, China promised to cut its emissions by 20% at the UN General Assembly. Analysts say without a binding agreement between China and the US, next month's Copenhagen summit can hardly reach a deal.
After the
collapse of the Soviet Union, even in the 1990s, many Americans perceived the US did not need China, while China needed the US more in the economic field. But now the situation has changed. China has a stronger voice in bilateral relations as it becomes more equal. Just as a senior US official pointed out recently, China has become a key element in dealing with global issues, and that is due to China's fast economic development and growing importance on the world stage.
More than a century ago, American President Theodore Roosevelt said, "Our future history will be more determined by our position on the Pacific facing China than by our position on the Atlantic facing Europe." And as that prediction comes true, it's causing concern today. In Europe, some officials worry that the transatlantic alliances have retreated from co-pilot to the back seat. Back in Washington, conservatives criticized the strategic reassurance, a new concept raised by a US official to describe ties with China. They say reassurance means the declining of the superpower in the face of a rising China. An American analyst disagrees.
Just because we're talking about strategic assurance in no way denotes that one side or the other is getting weaker. In reality, what it means is that both sides are mutually recognizing the other's strength and role that they play in the world. President Barack Obama has embraced a multilateral world, a world with many different leaderships that have a strong voice in the outcome in our future. And his engagement with China is simply an outcome of his belief in multiple leaders, not a zero-sum, we lose when you gain type of situation.
China also dispelled the doubts of a G2, which is used to describe the world economic roles of China and the US in some reports. China is still a developing country with a huge population and has a long way to go before it becomes modernized. We must always keep sober-minded over it. China is pursuing an independent foreign policy of peace and not aligning with any country or bloc of nations. But it's a fact that China and the US have never been so closely connected than today. Trade has maintained steady growth. The two countries are now each other's second largest trading partner. Trade has always been a lubricant in China-US ties, but it's also been a source of friction. 2 months ago, the US announced plans to slap higher tariffs on Chinese tires. China responded with its own anti-dumping investigations of US products, including cars.
I'll say it very frankly that there will be a number of issues on which we'll agree. There will be a number of issues on which we'll disagree. And this is perfectly normal and not a cause for concern, but is a necessary aspect of a serious and frank and constructive cooperative relationship.
America and China need each other, but they're a long way from trusting each other. On Monday, a CNN survey found 71% of Americans consider China an economic threat to the US, with 2/3 considering it a source of unfair competition for US companies. The survey also found 51% of the US public considered China a military threat. Last month, a Chinese website, www.huanqiu.com, also released a survey. It showed 86% of respondents felt indifferent towards Obama's visit, 50% worried that the US president would pressure China to let its currency rise, and 33% thought he would push China to buy more US debt. One of the goals in Obama's China trip was to broaden understanding from the governmental level to the public level.
Nong Ho. Good afternoon. There is a Chinese proverb, "Consider the past and you shall know the future." Surely we have known setbacks and challenges over the last 30 years. Our relationship has not been without disagreement and difficulty. But the notion that we must be adversaries is not predestined, not when we consider the past.
China and the US have become interdependent to a striking extent. The best way to face future challenges is to stand together. For good times and bad times, I'll be on your side forevermore. That's what friends are for. You can always count on me, for sure. That's what friends
Let's continue with that, because Barack Obama's very first visit to China as president gave him the opportunity to see his physical presence in shaping Sino-US relations. Analysts say although the future could be complicated, it would generally be beneficial to both sides in this globalized world that we live in today. Mutual trust is needed in settling the various challenges ahead. You're watching World Insight. Up next, what could be the biggest job in Europe? Who will take it on? We'll tell you after the break.